I'm Bethany.
And I'm Lauren.
Welcome to the Healing Collective podcast, where we explore the paradox of healing at the individual and the collective level.
Join us as we invite guests to share their personal paths to freedom.
Okay, well, I'm excited. Tim, just for context, I guess, we have a podcast. It's called The Healing Collective, and we talk about all different aspects of healing. A lot of times it's emotional, psychological, spiritual healing. And we've also had folks come on, like Tom came on, and we talked about healing from a planetary and climate and ecological perspective too. So Lauren, Tim is like a scientist, a PhD soil scientist, and a leader in the regenerative space, and basically is in touch with people all over the globe who are getting all these little pieces of information and data about how to do agriculture in a healthier, more interdependent, like more systematic, more, way, not the linear way that we've kind of been doing ag. So he's like a world leader in the space. And Tim, I'll say
I'm honored.
Yeah.
That you're here with us.
Yeah.
A world leader.
He also knows a lot about like the health of the body and stuff. And I'm thinking of one story you told me recently, specifically, Tim, but those are some of the like assumptions I made of things that we would talk about. And also we can talk about anything. So
let me add to that. Partly is I often get promoted as a PhD soil scientist, and I am into soil and training and teaching and growing and farming and doing research in that world and going to be publishing in that world. My PhD is in depth psychology.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which is Jungian based psychology.
Oh,
and
wow.
Me and
Lauren are real into that. So
the reason is that as I traveled the world and was in so many different countries and saw the ecological decline, I kept asking the question, why are we doing this? I mean, why do we do the kinds of inhumane things to each other? But why are we on a course, to suicide? Why would we do this as a species? And my dissertation was titled Awakening to Ecocide because, in essence, and this is where depth psychology comes in, 80% of our choices are made at the unconscious level. So part of this discussion would have to beg the question with the Thanatos, the suicide drive that Freud would talk about, in juxtaposition to the drive towards life, that the libido, not in a sexual sense, but in the drive towards the energy towards life that Jung would talk about. Where's the tension, and why are we leaning towards the destruction and death? So, and that's where, of course, has been my passion, as to how do we fix the three major problems in the world: climate, water shortage, and hunger, which all come back to soil carbon, all of those. And that's the through line for me of why I work in the space I work in. I got into arguments with eco-psychologists because I watched so many of them take eco-psychology as a way to go out into nature and draw from, which is the same extractive consciousness that we live our lives from, killing the planet. And I wanted to reverse that and say, how do we go out in nature and serve her? And how do we build her? And in that giving, don't we receive? And I think that's, it has to be, instead of a me focus, into a life focus. And that means for all. So there's a little soil scientist, yes, deeply in it, not my PhD.
I didn't know that. And
that's all right.
Thrilled. And yes,
it makes so much sense that you're here.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you're here, because that's what we talk about all the time here. So, and the folks that listen to this are of a similar mindset, I believe. So,
what is the conclusion that you drew in your dissertation? Why the eco side?
There's a lot of drivers from our own conscious, it's conscious but moves into unconscious, our own disassociation and denial of the consequences. So, and then are fulfilling our needs of emptiness with consumption, which is destruction in and of itself. So there's these overlaying things that show up in a behavior that do that. But the other thing, I mean, there's a whole bunch into this web of who we are because we're complex, obviously. But one of the pieces that I found as I spent more and more time studying, researching, but contemplating is our Judeo-Christian myth. The myth is based on exploitation dominance, and it's really a dominion attitude towards women, towards feminine, towards nature, towards extraction, towards abuse, towards use. And then we get into one other level that I would just throw at you quickly, Lauren, and that is that in our Western world now, but in humanity, we have our consciousness and our egos have become merged. And it's part of the problem we live with in our political scenario now, where there's a merger of what we term consciousness, belief structures with ego. And if you attack my belief, you're attacking me. And that's why we get so much anger because of that, instead of an acknowledgement of the feminine realm, the spiritual realm, the soul realm of the soul and the unconscious, which is actually, as we just said, makes more of our decisions than our conscious place. And there's a disconnection from connecting, whereas indigenous cultures often had an animistic religion where they had reverence towards the life in a tree, the life of animals, a spirit that lived behind that life. We have pulled all that out and looked at it as material. So we don't have a reverence, and we don't have that relationship to it. We only see it as a thing, as an object. And it becomes an other, not a we.
Which is what we've done to the feminine as well, making it an object rather than the essence. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So what I do in the world is I coach white leaders around their consciousness around like race and white supremacy culture and patriarchy. And the theory of change for the work I do is that we have to change at the level of consciousness. And so I'm very aligned. Basically, I was a principal on the west side of Chicago for a long time, wanted to disrupt the education system, systemic racism, got into it and realized all the things you're saying that you become aware of in, ecosystems, that it was at the end, it was like ego consciousness and fear consciousness and just a replication of the death cycle over and over again. And that if I really wanted to enact change, I needed to move to that. And then the way that Bethany and I know each other is consciousness coaching, where we focus on what's called the context instead of the content. So when we coach individuals, we coach them on what is trapped in their consciousness, where is their ego disassociating, and support them to integrate that in order to be available for, what we call creative energy, flow, presence, spirit, all of those things. So lots of alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this was my surprise for you today, Bethany.
Yeah. I mean, in our model, we use a lot of parts work, persona work. There's a lot of Jungian stuff that comes up to you. And I have a whole fascination with all of that. And like IFS and lots of other cool models that use a lot of that stuff that like I have practitioners that I do that work with. And we also do, I'm also an SEP, a somatic experience practitioner, because I was just in my work with all of this stuff and like doing my own personal work, I recognized that there was a lot of stuff I could like become aware of and get agency over and sort of like change a belief or change a thinking structure and get a different experience. And then there was certain stuff that lived in my body in such a way I couldn't talk myself out of it.
Right.
Like it top down modality was not, it had a limitation. And so a bottom up approach seemed to really unlock a lot more freedom for me. And we play with that stuff too. So those are the tools that we're coming with. And I use it all the time with Megafood, even just in conversations that we have with farmers. I mean, we met with folks I think you know, but one of our farm partners yesterday, and they were reporting that, and they live in a not classically dry area of the country, and they were reporting that they really are struggling water-wise, and that they're starting to just grow things that don't require water, and that farmers that they know locally didn't grow this year. They just didn't plant because of water, because they had like all of March, April, May, June was so dry, they didn't plant. And I had a real facing moment. So actually being able to, I was just accessing my full experience around that and not like talking past it, and sort of honoring that this thing that in our space of sort of like environmental activism that we work on around, like in the future, we are going to be not able to plant and grow, is here now.
No.
It's the first time I've had a farmer reflect that to me in these conversations. And I was, I noticed like overwhelm starting to happen in my system. And so I like used I kind of used my stuff to like help me get back into my body around it. And then kind of pointed it out to the group and kind of let us all have our moment with it, because it was so, it was such a big thing to face. I don't know. I feel like it's all the same, I guess is what I'm saying. I use all these skills with Megafood and like a lot of my Megafood skills here and stuff, but it all feels like one thing to me now.
And well, I think then your work that you both are doing and helping people is really crucial. But at this moment in time, the unrecognized grief, fear, trauma of climate change is on us. And as we spent those 4 years in Africa, every farmer I talked to on that continent, or who came to be educated where I was in South Africa, from whatever country they came from, every single one could tell you about climate change. And I came back to the United States dealing with farmers that were in denial. You know, here the poor peasant, uneducated farmer was living, breathing, experiencing what you talked about. We're even in a village where there were suicides committed because they could no longer provide food for their families due to climate. It had changed so radically. And the scientists said Africa would be the first impacted. The trouble, I guess trauma for me was, I mean, I knew all of that was real, but to come back here, not only to run into the denial of it, but I couldn't even get Americans to give a damn. And the culture shock that Judalon and I suffered most was that every summer we came back to America was to step back into this country. That was the biggest culture shock for us every time. So it was hard.
Can you help us feel the contrast? Like, can you help us experience the contrast of the two cultures?
So, I mean, it can almost be a global culture, because a lot of Europeans that would come down there too, I mean, they were all in touch with this more, but they were, I'll tell you a quick thing. You talk about a cultural contrast, and I'll give you an African one, but I remember years ago coming from somewhere, as the Middle East or somewhere, as I was flying through Germany, and I needed to run into the pharmacy at the airport. And I ran in and I said to the lady behind the counter, I said, "Do you have," and she interrupted me and she said, "Good morning." And I stopped in my shoes and I go, what a rude American I am, because I walked in with an American attitude of, this is a business, you're here in service of that business, and I have a transaction I want to make, and that's why we're both here, right? No, she was basically saying, human to human, good morning, how are you? And that was one of the things in Africa that was always present every day, and particularly, especially with the Blacks, it was, how are you? You know, fine, how are you? And then how's your family? And it's before you started any other conversation. And it was, the other thing was, in the Black cultures in the villages that would come, and a lot of my field workers came from there, most of their cultures had no sense of future. They couldn't define future. It wasn't a reality to them. Past and present was, and they created future in the present. And we live so much into the future. we live so much into a transactional relationship, and we don't sit in an honoring of each other and being in a caring place with each other. So it is a remarkable difference. But here, the consumerism is overwhelming. The amount of consumerism and therefore destruction of Earth, a disconnection, dissociation for what it's doing to Earth, what we do to her through our consumptive patterns. The marketing, the advertising, we go on and on and on, is off the charts. So that's the other part that still remains a culture shock for me. So.
Is it unchanged? Do you have a sense in your experience, at least, because I know that you're talking to people internationally on such a regular basis, much more than I am. I've got a story that, like, there's a little bit of a pressure around a wake up happening. And I think it's just like COVID and race relations and just all the stuff that's happened. There's all these collective pressures that are like inviting a awakening. And I don't know if it's because I'm organizing myself in such a way to find other people who want to talk like this and want to heal stuff and want to grow stuff and want to shift stuff, and that's a trend line through and something's happening here, or if that's just me and my friends and my people. And that's why I notice it. Do you have a sense of it? Does it feel different than 5 or 10 years ago?
I'd have to contemplate that. So I often get asked, do I have any hope? And I say no, but I'll tell you why that's the case. But let me just step back to yours in a quick response to yours. I see the radical differences in generational orientation towards a question like that. And the Zers and Xers, et cetera, I see a radical sort of focus on what seems to matter, or what they seem to focus on, versus maybe my age range would focus on a little bit more. But I see a much more radical separation in the consciousness and focus you're bringing today versus the general population is bringing. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is, if we would take the percentage of people that have a focus that you and Lauren are carrying forward and trying to help and coach people to, that's a very small percentage. And some people would say, so does it even matter? Because the general populace, they're not on the same wavelength that you all. By the same token, when we deal with the questions around consciousness, we know that the threads of consciousness reach beyond, and when we get into not just the metaphysical questions, but if we get into the physics or the quantum physics levels, we know that it can reach deeper, and that I think it's important work. So period, it's just important work. And it's not that you're going to reach 7.5 billion people, Bethany, but that by reaching others that can reach, how fast can we elevate it? That's where I lose hope, but I realize that's both my ego and my rationality that says we can't get there. What I have to remind my ego is I'm not in charge, and I can't figure this whole thing out. I am nowhere close to having the level of cosmic intelligence that can understand if there's a plan, what that full plan is. If there's an evolution, how fast it goes, where the tipping point lies. It seems my responsibility simply is to engage it as consciously and as heartfelt as I can, with an ego detachment from it, and serve humanity, serve life, serve Earth the best I can. And then it's not up to me after that. Mm-hmm. So.
That's my sense too. My sense is that, so even in the program that I'm doing, I did like kind of an in-depth meditation before I started. And what I was told is like, there are really specific people in the population that you're calling forward. And it's about 1% of the population that would be available for this type of work. And you have to trust like the seeds that they plant. And I see it in my mind as a mycelial network that's building, slowly in the ecosystem. And there's like some Charles Eisenstein talks about that we're moving from the age of separation towards the age of interbeingness. And we're in like a bridging time. So if you've been in an age of complete separation, and then separation from God, separation from earth, separation from other beings, separation from yourself, there's a reunion, a period of reunion that is really, really uncomfortable. Like that transition is really uncomfortable. And I think evolution always kind of chooses people to go first and place, to start the collective weaving and to start kind of being the prophets almost for what's coming. But I don't know, Bethany, when you were like a collective awakening, I think there's a big collective shift happening. I don't think the majority of people are coming to it from an awake, conscious place. Mm-hmm. I think evolution is still going to do whatever it needs to do, regardless of the orientation of your awareness towards that.
There's another element, another layer in this. So I'm not an astrologist at all. And a lot of people would say it's a bunch of hokey pokey or whatever, but it was funny. I ended up going to a conference once by an author who was an astrologist, and it was a room full of the other participants were astrologers. And I go, wow, where have I just found myself? Because he was talking literally about sort of some depth psychological realms around this. And this one astrologer sat with me. She looked at my chart. She told me some things that my mother had told my wife about me that I didn't know had been talked about, that my Jungian analyst had told me. And I thought, how in the hell did this astrologer figure that out from the chart? I go, oh my God, what is this about?
Well, me and Lauren are really, really on that shit too. And I've actually I've been in training, like getting personally tutored for like over a year. Yeah.
Wow.
Which is only scratching the surface. Astrology is like really. Yeah,
for sure. Well, I was going to take this to the point that a professor that I didn't have, but I got to know him, Richard Tarnas, wrote a book called Psyche and Cosmos. It's a big, thick book. It took him more than a decade to write because he realized as he was going to posit a cosmological, astrological soul, sort of world soul idea, he was going to have to back it up to the hilt because it was going to meet so much resistance, both in the psychological worlds as well as in the deniers of astrology, et cetera. So he did research and rewrote and did more research. And he really makes a case in that back to Lauren's comment, that it is actually how the universe lines up and supports certain consciousness shifts or basically sort of devolution of consciousness, depending on what's going on planetarily. And if you're an astrologist, I think that would make a lot of sense to you. This is going to happen. This is not going to happen. Or this is being supported, even though Bethany and Lauren are pushing this forward, their actual work can't be supported for it to fulfill on a grand scale. Or maybe it is the time that it will be all of a sudden blossom, like the Renaissance, like democracy here in this country, like when the Da Vinci and those artists showed up at the same time. All of this, what is the universe helping to support at that time? And that's where I'm not in control, but pay attention and, what can I support?
Well, you bring up, go ahead. Can I add on to that real quick? Like you bring up a really important idea that I've really been playing with is like when we talk about the collective zooming out and even talking about the constellation of planets, right? That like astrology is really pointing to that everything that's happening on Earth is impacted by the interdependence of what's happening between all of the planets in our solar system and then their interactions and their own evolution, right? And then how they're part of this like bigger universe. And so in that way, like a lot of the collective shifts and awakening and awareness of everything that we're experiencing is this alchemy of all of the different evolutions of all the planets and how it's impacting us on Earth, which can be like such a mind.
Yeah, using a Jungian term alchemy, let me also then impose onto or offer into your conversation is the planetary archetypes rather than the planets themselves. And what are the archetypal influences that they bring? And that's the archetypes do. Those are the gods that seem to want to live through us, and they can feed our negative and feed those archetypes, those energies feed our positives. And, which dog are we going to feed within ourselves, but to be aware. And what I hear the two of you doing is working very hard within yourselves to bring to consciousness what's happening, what's going on from your unconscious realms, from your bodily felt realms, et cetera, which is a much more conscious way to live. And that's part of what Jung asked us to do. And that is to bring to consciousness as much of the unconscious as we can. And therein, the kinds of sort of radical destructive runs, like the Nazi, the development of the Nazi consciousness, or the development of the kinds of destructive forces that are occurring in this country right now, with some of the hardline angry people that will kill, those archetypes want that blood. Whereas the other archetypes, can we stop feeding those and feed the ones that really are more about love, connection, life, support? And they're both apparently needed in the universe. I can't explain that, but they're present. And it seems our responsibility is to be as conscious and intentional as we can with them.
The other piece with that's at least for me, the more that I track the astrology and I'm aware of even like daily and weekly planetary shifts and the impact on consciousness, the less agency I feel, but not in like a victim way, but just a way of like that awareness and consciousness is really just me, the observer. It's not so much me, I can change something in one direction or the other. Like my horoscope and the planetary shifts in the houses, it's like, no, like I'm going to work on finances at this specific time in my life or in this year, or when I was 39, it was already mapped that the planetary shifts were going to create this huge upheaval in my life. And can I be with that? And there's a way that it feels so much less personal. And I think I would like shame myself in the past for my cycles and my shifts. And why am I so energized? And in July and then in August, I'm so tired. And now I'm just like, oh, I'm just riding the wave, the energetic wave of all of life and being with it. But it's been very humbling.
I agree with you, Lauren. And I would also posit that I don't think I would want to be in a space of letting those energies dictate. By the same token, I wouldn't want my ego to completely override and not be in relationship with. And so I think a lot of it is to be in a relationship with what is, realize that you can't control all of it, but still within your free will and your heartfelt choices of what agency you do have as the spiritual being, as this conscious spiritual being, to make choices within that space. And I think that's important. I think really important.
Well, what I hear you pointing to, I guess what comes up for me, Tim, in the last couple of things that you said, like one around, I guess we need that kill energy. I guess you're talking about Mars. You're talking about Mars energy. I guess we need that. I don't know why, but I guess we need it. Yeah. And then also here, like around, I hear Lauren maybe pointing to the difference, not between passivity, but maybe surrender. Like she's surrendering something. And I think we're pointing to polarities and like how we contain multitudes. So everyone has some kill in us. Yeah. For us to survive from an animism perspective, like we're going to eat, we're going to kill, that is here. And can we have a healthy relationship with our Martian infants? Mars is in all of our birth charts. How healthy can we have that? Can it be in the right balance? Can we not try to get rid of anything? And I know you know what I'm talking about from an ecological standpoint, not try to control and get rid of things, but welcome in the whole. And then you have, I think, balance. And so, and what she's pointing to, I think some people's journey is very passive and surrendered. And maybe the polarity that wants to shift in them is more agency and let's go do something and let's create something. And I want to take more control of being the creator of my life. And some people, or maybe some people's time in their journey of where they're at in their development, they've been doing and bringing up the other polarity of surrender. I find that with astrology too, that it gives me some access to ride the wave. And that's actually something I want to balance in me, because I think, I have a lot of let's get it done folks that's running all the time. So it's actually really friendly to my system and probably everyone who knows me, for me to be able to sit back a little bit.
I like that. All right, Lauren, I defer to Bethany.
I think you're both holding a truth of my experience, which is surrender is more my orientation. Early in my life, I had to really get knocked down multiple times to surrender. And now I surrender much sooner as a result of that. But I am trying to really find like where my agency is, like the edge of surrender and agency. And so an example is like the other day, I knew that this one particular day was like astrologically going to be challenging, and I set some intentions around it. There's days that the astrology has pointed to conflicts, like creating conflicts in my relationships, and I'm bringing like more intention. And when those conflicts arise, I'm holding it differently, and I'm not getting as involved in the conflict because I'm understanding that it's just a part of this bigger whole.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, like this year is really about this complete overhaul of all the ways that I'm in relationship and how I'm in relationship and my relationships. So there's been a lot of like loss, like actual death kind of loss, separation loss. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of moments where I'm like, where my mantra is like, you don't control anything. Like, and you can think you're moving in this direction and that rug can just get pulled, and you just, and death can be like that too, So it's it's a both and. It's just like, I am on a journey of finding the edge of my agency, but I do appreciate that the more equanimity, the more love consciousness, and the more that I can observe myself, the less triggered reactivity that I bring to my life. Whether we call it choice or surrender, my life is different. My life is more manageable and less, there's less suffering.
Yes. I appreciate that. And I'll tell you, that's one of the things, talk about culture, and this culture, particularly with so many of the self-help books and so many of the conquering books of how you're going to make $1 million or whatever. It's an ego-driven, I'm in control of my life approach to it. Instead of the more feminine, soul-based work of being aware of these other influences and forces, being aware of, and we may talk about the astrological influences, and working within and working with the best we can. So I appreciate what you said. What I find interesting at times is that something amazing will happen. I go, oh my God, so-and-so called and they want this and this, and we might be able to do this and this, and this is going to be so great for the work. And then I realize my ego wants to say, look at what I did. And then I step back and realize I didn't do any of it. Sure, I tried to help facilitate or talk to or whatever, but it was the support from the other realms that actually is bringing it forward, which is a Jungian understanding of a synchronicity, that you are living into your life in an appropriate manner. You're listening in and you're working with, and then serving the soul, the spirit from that realm. And it's being supported externally.
So Jung, I don't know this. So are you saying, am I hearing you correctly, that Jung would say when you notice synchronicities, it's evidence that you're kind of in flow and because I didn't know that. I feel like either I pay attention to synchronicities or I don't, or they happen or they don't. And I didn't ever put those two together. That
a lot of times we don't notice the synchronicities. We have to be observant as the two of you are talking, how you're living your life now, and you will see them. And the story about Jung and synchronicity, where he developed it, and then the quantum physicist Pauli started to connect with Jung, and they tried to describe it from a quantum physics level and a soul spiritual level together. But Jung had a client in his office who was telling about a dream with a scarab beetle in it. And Jung kept getting distracted by something hitting the window, kept hitting the window. And he turned around and it was a scarab beetle, and he opened it and it came in. And so, he started to describe synchronicity as how that dream was being supported from the external world, and how this woman and her dream was a critical thing, the way he was working with her, to assist her, in her own analysis work. So, yes, I mean, I think sometimes it's sort of like, it feels like, wow, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Well, that's my ego projecting what should happen. And often that never comes to pass. But something else comes up and I go, oh, I wasn't really paying attention. That synchronistically is where the next move was supposed to go. That's what I was supposed to be working towards. And I had no clue.
Yeah, or just that like sometimes we can trust our impulses, even if the ego's online, and noticing what it's going to get around that sometimes we're still taking an invitation and we don't have to reject anything that makes our ego feel good, that we can make room for both. And watch it.
Right.
Watch it.
So, I mean, in my generation, it was always called a woman's intuition, and intuition was allowed for the women and men. That was not rational enough. It was not, logical enough to go with it. And yet in the Myers-Briggs, which comes out of Jungian work, I'm highly intuitive. That's more my nature, even as a male. But it is, how do we listen to those messages, those whispers inside of us, and be able to respond to those? Because that intuition, I often ask, and it seems I always ask women, how many times when you went against your intuition did it work out? They always say, never. So I think it's something to really pay attention to. And we disclaim it, or we diminish its importance. We do. We throw it out the window, and that's absurd.
And we just get.
Would you say that that's very American?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that that's American? Do you see that also?
Yeah, very Western. Very Western. I don't know that Europeans know any longer, unless they're very traditional, still hold into that too much. But I think that more indigenous cultures are the ones that were more listening, receiving, definitely are probably closer to that. But our culture does everything in the world to take us away from it. Our culture does everything in the world to direct us towards this emptiness, fulfilling this emptiness through purchasing this or aspiring for that or getting more money or whatever. And it becomes a directed, focused goal. How many times we set goals up, and we're going to, the world you work in, Bethany, you have to achieve certain levels, and that it takes you out of the process of just being and being in relationship with those inner workings. Now, you can still be in it to a degree, but, a production-oriented life shifts that focus towards output, not towards listening and being with what you're kind of being told or what wisdom is trying to share with you.
The coaching modality, like the model that Lauren and I both were trained in and practice in, is called it's conscious leadership. And it didn't originate with Conscious Leadership Group. I forget who did the 4 states of consciousness? Who did that, Lauren?
Michael Beckwith.
Oh yeah, Michael Bernard Beckwith. Are you familiar with him?
No.
So it's just the idea that you can classify ourselves into always being in one of 4 states of consciousness, and we're just ping-ponging around between them all the time. One is we call by me, which is like victimhood, to me, which is victimhood. Like everything's happening to me. Like I'm a victim of my circumstances. All of the power and agency is out there and it's happening to me. And it's like, it's just a classic kind of triggered, scared. And most people spend like most of their time there on some level, at least some part is there most of the time. Then there's by me, which is more of this like creator consciousness, like I'm going to create the things. And there can be like an egoic part of that. But yeah, like more, I'm going to do it. I'm going to have agency. I feel like I know that part real well. And, and then there's something called through me, which is this surrendered experience. And it also points to the listening that you're talking about, this less clearly demarcated knowing and like surrendering to what seems to want to happen. You get an invitation, you take it, you kind of take what the universe is handing you. And then there's as me, which is more of a oneness experience, right? And maybe we touch into as me on rare occasions or medicine work or whatever it is, but we're not most of us aren't holding that all the time, but we touch into it. It's this window. And we might have a non-dual experience here and there kind of a thing. And I just think we're just real oriented around to me and by me consciousness when it comes to business. It's what we've built here. It's where we are. And what does it look like to run a through me business? What does it look like when the goals of your business are more like less tangible, like it's more principle based or intention based than number based or outcome based, things like that. And how differently would we organize ourselves? What kind of different decisions would we make if we invited and normalized that type of consciousness, at least being a part of the equation?
Right. Well, you coming from a B corporation, you know that corporations in this country used to have sort of three focuses. One was return to the shareholder, two was a commitment to community, and three was a commitment to their employees. And when Milton Friedman, the University of Chicago, started to push this, no, it's only return to the shareholder, all those other values disappeared, and greed and the concentration of wealth and the mergers took off. Community went by the wayside, workers went by the wayside, et cetera. You're talking about another level, Bethany, which would take us to a whole nother relationship and consciousness with Earth, with each other, with community, with ourselves, actually, in that process. So that's something the seeds of consciousness we should be planting, your articulation of that into the mindset of humanity.
Well, even B Corp, it's like they're pointing at something, but the structure and framework that they're using to do it is still the same consciousness. It's still, you have to have a certain amount of points and you get it to go up by a certain amount of points in a certain amount of time. And that's where businesses are. So I get that.
And if you were to try to do anything else, there's so many consequences, like the system around taxation, like it's like just you can't fully exist.
Just the assumption of growth, and that without growth, there's not success. That's our Tom Newmark, who we've had on the podcast, our mutual friend, he talks about, what is it? The hedgehog or I forget what little rodent or animal, but it's just the ever growing, like it has to grow. And that's the only way that like businesses know that they exist or something,
it seems
it's this linear rather than more than less linear.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it comes to, and it's a depth psychologist was doing a seminar once, and he ended up doing the topic on the 7 deadly sins, and basically was talking about these archetypal energies playing through us, and one is greed. And that's something that that's not just the corporate world that we can point at the corporations, it's the humans within it who end up on a track of how do you accumulate, grow. And it all ends up at a core that has to do with that, which is a destructive element. I mean, the 7 deadly sins are referred to as deadly for a reason. And you've asked for here in this discussion for a consciousness that's about life instead of death. And that's an important, I think, distinction, a line between those two, for sure. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Enneagram, Tim?
Yes, I am.
Lauren just had something. Do you have something you want to say before we go there?
Well, I was going to go a different direction. I just wanted to say that, the way I'm experiencing you, Tim, is contradictory to my archetype of males in your generation. So like the way that you talk about the earth as a her, the way that you speak about feminine energy, so like lovingly and appreciatively in this like very balanced way, your awareness of that. And I'm just curious if that's always been your orientation or if like life brought you to that, you know?
Life brought me back to that. So I think as a child, I probably was more nurturing, but as the sort of the design of our culture, I was to be a male and to succeed and to compete and to, go forward and conquer. But when you look at the result of that and not listen into what basically is a balanced relationship, masculine and feminine, you're out of balance, and that becomes a deep pathology within us. It becomes a destroying element within us. So we have to bring those into some level of balance. And when I talk about the feminine, one of the things that I think is important is I'm not talking about women or girls. I'm talking about feminine nature, because we can cite a lot of examples of women or girls who have adopted this masculine, dominant, extractive, destructive, put your hand down, not you.
Not the destructive. I'm sure I have destructive in me, but I do have.
But more of what we're looking at for that feminine balance. And we as a society are masculine. I mean, as far as extractive, dominant, greed. And think about the kinds of archetypal masculine energies that overtook the consciousness of this country after 9/11. And I was sort of begging for leaders. I was in a leadership training thing to say, step back. Why would we invade Iraq? What's that going to do? That's a war energy. That's a revenge energy. But what is the most even pragmatic, not just loving feminine? What's the most pragmatic approach? And obviously it wasn't pragmatic. It was destructive to our own nation. It was destructive to our own soldiers. It was destructive to hundreds of thousands of Middle Easterners. It wasn't even a pragmatic approach, but the energy became that dominant, conquering, killing, revengeful, masculine, bloodthirsty consciousness. And so at those points, Lauren, I get a little really deeply saddened inside that we are out of control of our feeling nature. I don't mean emotions. I mean feeling nature, feeling quality. And Robert Sardello, the School of Spiritual Psychology, talks a lot about heart consciousness. And I don't want to go to that space because when Carl Jung came to America, he went to see the Taos Indians in New Mexico. And he asked, was in a conversation with the chief, and the chief there said, well, the problem with you Europeans, not Americans, you whites in essence, is that you think with your head. And Jung said, well, what do you think with? And this Native American wise person who prayed the sun up every morning said, we think with our hearts. And if you begin to move into that space, if you literally center in that space in your body and let that feel expanded and try and act from literally that space and feeling, you can't hurt anybody. You can't take from anybody. You are in a space of giving. You are in a whole different energy field and a whole different way of being. And if you think from there, it would change the way we're in relationship to Earth. And she would be flourishing now, not stressed.
Preach.
There's a book. Yeah, Charles Eisenstein. Are you familiar with Charles Eisenstein?
I am a little familiar with him. Yes, because the mayor of the city here, San Luis Obispo, she's had long conversations with me about Charles. So I've had to listen to some of his. Not had to. I have listened to some of his talks. But yeah.
Yeah, when I first listened to his podcast, I wasn't into it because his kind of like personality voice wasn't super intriguing to me. But I read a book by him called The More Beautiful World That Our Hearts Know Is Possible. Mm-hmm. And he basically goes through every part of society. Like every chapter is, like money, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, how would we think about this through what our heart knows is true, what our heart knows is possible?
Beautiful.
And I like to think of it as like, I think that evolution is moving us, and evolution moves slowly towards like integration of heart, mind, body, and soul. And that's really the highest expression of communication, is having all of it online. And what you call the masculine, these masculine traits, that imbalance of the mind, it was necessary for this kind of like catapult into industrialization and these, things that we learned in awareness, but it creates, to your point, imbalance. And what now we're coming back to body. And I think as we learn more about the quantum field and that becomes more mainstream, then we're going to start to integrate energy and realize how much we're just feeling each other is just attuning to the energetic field that's interdependent, and on and on and on. And so I have this vision of like the highest evolution of a human body being like, what I think even what we call intuition is body awareness. I think it's like our body's GPS talking to us, and that our body was created to have the heart and the mind, the gut and energy all in balance and communicating in this integrated way.
And what if it's your spiritual body communicating through you, through all of you, and that then you're feeling it bodily?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm starting to, I started this practice about a year or two ago, where I was like, I'm not going to override my body, and I'm just going to see what happens. So I always tell the story as an example. I don't know if I've told it on here, but I went to Six Flags with my son, and we go every summer. And it's like, he's one of those kids where like, we like to do opposite things. So there's very few things where it's like, okay, we both like to do this. Mm-hmm. So we get to Six Flags, and I'm in this practice, and I get to the first roller coaster, and I had a clear, like my body was terrified. No. And I said, I can't get on the roller coaster. Like I have this commitment to honor my body. Same thing happened at a water park, and I love water slides. And there's just been, and now it's getting more and more, but I'm like, oh, like there is really a GPS in here that knows something so much more divine, than what my mind can anticipate or conceive. And it's not logical. Like the body, even the heart to a certain extent, like when you follow those, they don't make logical sense to the mind. And there's this kind of, for me, there's been this bridge of faith of like stepping into the unknown and waiting to kind of see later, oh, like now it makes sense why all those things happen and why I felt called to do that. But at the time, it didn't.
Yeah.
At the risk of confusing soul and spirit, which is, I think, gets confused all the time because they're hard to delineate for us, particularly in the West. But back to your discussion around this, Lauren, it reminds me of one of Jung's stories where he went to Africa, and it was in the Model T era. So it was a really, a slow car, but they would go 20 miles an hour, maybe, or maybe even less on some of those African roads. And they were driving for a number of hours, and they stopped and got out for a minute to rest a little bit, stretch their legs. And the African traveling with them got out and laid on the ground. And Jung said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm waiting for my soul to catch up to me." And in essence, we get on an airplane and we take off, and we have jet lag, and we talk about all the physiological rationales, but literally we weren't grounded. We weren't in connection with life and the forces of life. We weren't probably bare feet on the ground, grounding down our energies into earth and that great mother feeding us back. What are all of those soul, spirit, body, consciousness relationships that we disassociate from, that we separate from, or we think, that's superstition, instead of feeling into what it really is and how it is a connection that gives us a presence in a relationship that has to be reverential, because we're all alive together. We're all brothers and sisters, as the Native Americans would say, with the animals and the trees and the plants. But in our Western world, we are so above it. We're so separate from it. We are so, that's for our use, not for our reverence attitude, that we, I think, are in a great soul deficit, in a great desert inside of ourselves.
I'm sorry, my puppy is over here.
Yeah. No worries.
And I mean to interrupt you. He started chewing on the couch.
Tim, what you're pointing to, we talk about in somatic experiencing all the time. Good. Because, there's a couple layers of it. It's like our bodies, literally like the oldest part of our brain, of our nervous system, didn't evolve to like zip around in a tin can at 70 miles an hour. Like there's still stuff that we're still trying to catch up. Yeah. And it's almost become normalized. There's so many overwhelming things about this modern world that we live in and all of the made up rules that we have that we're socialized into, that there's so many ways where we cut off connection to our body. Right. And so even in the trainings that we do, like it's like 3-year program, it's kind of intense. So in these trainings, one of the first things they invited us into was like, I know you guys all probably think that because you're in a training that you're supposed to like be on camera and look at us and like sit up straight and like focus and take notes. But they were like, use this to practice. What does your body want? What impulses do you notice? Do you want to lay down? Do you want your video off? Do you want to come and go and whatever? Like I did like an hour of the training one time from the bath with my video off. Because I was just like, okay, let's go all in on like listening to my impulses of what my body most wants right now. What is it like to be in that space? Because that's what we're holding that space with clients and inviting them into their own body experience in a gentle, friendly way, because you can't go too fast into it actually, because it's overwhelming for a lot of people. Sure. So I thought of that when you were speaking. Good. And also there's a lot of people who have a lot of access to the spiritual realm, and they're getting all kinds of stuff, but they're not that embodied. And so I do think that there's like the animal body, and like if it's overwhelmed, if there's a trauma or there's overwhelm or there's something happening, it's triggered, it doesn't have like as much access to this other stuff. And so it's like, there's kind of on top of the animal body, there's like the personalities and the family of origin and like all the stuff that happens. And then outside of that, on a soul level, there's a spiritual access. Yeah. And like a big part of my work is how do we get all three working together at the same time?
This is the direction I was going to go to, because so I have a mentor and a friend who works in psychedelic medicine, and her like as a therapeutic practice. And what she always says is that like because of the level of trauma in the bodies, we're holding such a fear vibration because we're in survival so much, and that like our soul literally cannot fully plug in to the root chakra. It's like coming in the body and then leaving the body because the vibrational frequencies are not fully aligning. And so some of the work, especially with MDMA and trauma healing, is this idea it raises the body's vibration long enough that the soul can tolerate, and it teaches the body what vibration it can hold at what level. And then your nervous system starts to, once the journey is over, like try to find its way back to that vibration. And my first journey was about rooting into the body and setting an intention to be fully here. And my experience is the more of these journeys I do, the more integrated I feel. And I would say the more ordinary, because the kind of the high side of being able to leave the body like that is like, I have awareness of so many dimensions of reality and so many levels of complexity outside of this reality. And I think so many of us have left and have all these awareness, but I think the consequence of it is when you're not fully in a body, you cannot fully attune to what's happening. You can't fully attune to other people. You can't feel the responsibility it is to be in a body, the reciprocity that's asked of us in a body. And so you can basically treat planet Earth like Vegas, like, you know, or like a video game, and be like, I just want to come here and do this, trash it. And then your soul to a certain extent is not fully here to feel and accept all it is. And I say this all the time, like, I think enlightenment now is being fully in a body. I think there was a time where enlightenment was learning to leave the body and learning to hold like this detached. That was important in evolution, in the evolution of consciousness. But I don't think that you can be fully enlightened and be detached and separate anymore. I think enlightenment is the integration of all of those things.
My intuition is that you're correct about that and the embodiment of, but it is odd to me though that we do need to listen, but I do think we need our feet on the ground, literally on earth, more and more, and being in touch with the wholeness of that, because we are part of that wholeness. And we separate, we leave that connection. And so, you know, our work in the soil, our work in rebuilding the life of the soil is to be on our, and sometimes, I mean, literally for me, literally it's on my hands and knees at times, you know, in that and being with that. And to me, that's when I feel the best. I don't hear in front of a computer, you know, or sitting in a chair or being in an airplane, for God's sake. That's not when I feel the most comforted or the most related to, as I do just when I'm with Earth, you know, and my hands in the soil are with the plants. It is an unconscious consciousness of more of a oneness. So that is a piece, I think, that can humble us deeply and at the same time elevate our sense of being to much higher levels without any outside inducements. I mean, just that itself.
I totally agree. And so when I did the first journey, like we did it on a mountain in Colorado where there's like no people. And what I've realized is, like, I have 2 dogs, I have plants all around me now. Like for most of my life, I had no energetic connection to earth or plants or animals. Like I was totally disconnected. When I would see people like who were so obsessed with animals, so into their dogs, I would just be like, I don't get that. Or you have plants all in your house, like how do you keep them alive? Like, and so whether it's with a journey or just earth itself, which I absolutely think Mother Earth can do it without, you know, that particular medicine or anything. The first piece was like, oh, earth can hold me. Like, and how so much of the trauma that lives in my body, and I think lives in the collective, is our relationships, our communities. We've gone through such a thing, to your point, all the separation that we've created away from each other. It's like we don't trust that anyone can hold us, but starting that the earth could hold me, and like feeling like all my pain, she could hold it. All my rage, she could hold it.
Right. That's right. I agree.
And like all the work Bethany's doing, everything, like now I'm obsessed with learning about it. I actually express my purpose in the world as supporting people to find reunion with themselves, each other, and our Mother Earth. But none of that was true 2 years. Like I didn't even have that orientation to like Mother Earth as a living, breathing entity that I could feel as I don't know what to call it, a being. Like I feel her. So when you talk about her, like as a her, like that is my experience. And I have so much sadness that I spent so much of my life not in that experience.
Yeah, anyone who comes to that experiential level begins to understand that, and therefore you and I can have a conversation around it. If you haven't experienced it, it's like, oh, those tree huggers, you know, or whatever. Actually, I get frustrated with a lot of tree huggers because I listen to them. They go up and literally hug a tree and they go, oh, I feel this and this, and it told me this and it gave me that. And I'm kind of going, what did you give it? Where are we in service? Because it's where I think a lot of healing can come from, is when we are serving earth and we are healing earth. That's in service. It's like when you go and help somebody who's hurting or sick, you're focused on giving, and you know you're better off personally after you've done it. Everybody's better off. But when you just go to take, like, give me, the earth and yourself are not better off. And the same, I would argue, in nature is how do we, yes, we know when we walk through a forest, we feel better there, and they can explain it as energetic fields and a lot of different things going on. And it's true. But I would say in a conscious way, and Bethany, you were talking so much about bringing ourselves into a more conscious realm around this and feeling within our bodies. How are we sure not to be just absorbing, but to be in that space of heart or of a giving or of love, so that it's a two-way, that it is supporting, the Steiner anthroposophic people would talk about those elementals and those spirits that live in nature that have been abandoned by us, and they are not being fed. It's part of creation at some level we probably can't see or we can't feel or we don't understand, but there are those energies that need our conscious attention to and a giving, and that will feed us, that will cure her, that will cure us, I would argue, in this conversation.
Well, it's a nice transition because we haven't talked about your work that much in the world. And one of the things that I'll say I noticed, I guess it's a piece of feedback, Tim, that you can choose to receive or not. But when Lauren was talking, when we were saying, oh, we're kind of like hopeful and optimistic, and we think maybe there's something happening here. And you were like, I don't think so. I think I'm a little more pessimistic about some kind of big shift or change, or even that maybe that we're even in the beginning of it or not. And that you get some more sober perspective or expectation around that. Where I don't see that in you, like where actually you epitomize potential, is when you talk about soil. And so, like, part of what happens in my day job in my industry is people will write pieces around, the limitations of regenerative agriculture. And it's really not, we really can't do this. We really can't do that. And it kind of looks like this, and this isn't going to work because of this. And, there's like I have a whole conspiracy persona who's, judging, whatever, a big ag or tech companies or whoever is behind a lot of these pieces, but I'll read it and I get scared. And what I do is I call Tim and he talks me through where the fallacies are, and he fills me back up with a lot of hope and optimism that is appropriate and actually really necessary to be even able to keep doing this work and to keep standing for what we're standing for, Tim. So can you, so my feedback is, yes, you are hopeful. And are you willing to pendulate and see, I wonder how the hopefulness can show up in other places, and how how the realism and the, and all that. So I see it all in you, I guess. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about what you do at the world, and can you fill us up with some of the hope and potential about what it looks like when we actually do ask the question, what are we doing for Mother Earth, and how can we support Mother Earth? What the potential is around climate change and species survival.
So let me reframe the hope part, and I'll move right into the soil part, or the earth part, or the what we can do part, and reframe it in this way, Bethany. So you're right. When I say I'm not hopeful, I say, but I need to get to that. And my point is to say, if I look at all of the indicators, we're not going to fix this. We're not going to make it. But it's not up to me. That's for one. I don't know the outcome, and there can be a real transition, a consciousness shift, a real commitment shift that maybe it happens. Who knows how that's going to work out? What I don't like about hope is that I find in most people it becomes a placeholder for action. And it's just like someone was telling about some social issue that says, this gives me a lot of hope that this is probably going to change. And that distanced me personally from doing anything. Now, that was hopefully it's going to work. I have hope it's going to change. And these are the reasons why I all of a sudden disengaged, because, well, good, there's hope there. And that's my point, is to say that.
And there's another aspect to hopefulness.
For action. What I'd say is when we act, we're not in control of the outcome, but we've given our all to make the change, to do all we can do. And let's get others to help us do it. Now, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, Gay and Katie Hendricks, I don't know if you know about them, the Hendricks Institute, but they talked about different like denial, and they talked about like really obvious denial, and then in the finer realms, hopefulness is actually a layer of denial, a way that we don't face, a way that we can use hopefulness to not face what's here. And I really agree that isn't the same thing as what I'm talking about, but something about, I do feel like you have a lot of information that most people don't have, that is real data and potential, I guess I would call it, maybe.
Potential. The potential is huge. It is huge. You know, about 4,000 years ago, nature, in her wisdom, brought 4,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide down to less than 300, at a level that supports the biodiverse life that allows humans to be here in our consciousness, in our beauty, that couldn't happen with 4,000 parts per million. And it is when someone says, well, when you say soil can capture all the carbon, and they say, well, show us the proof. I listened to Tom Newmark say this just the other day. He said, well, nature's already proven it. I mean, nature did prove it. Nature did it. And what we're talking about doing in soil is simply supporting nature. So it's so complex and wise that when we look at the biome of the soil, like a healthy human gut biome, when it is healthy, everything works together. And the plant signals to the organisms what it needs. The organisms rally and either create or demineralize or free up or transport those nutrients to the plant, because the plant feeds them sugars and carbohydrates, which is all carbon-based, all coming out of the atmosphere into the ground. And it is deposited in either an exudate that feeds these organisms or in root biomass, et cetera, that will stay in that soil for a long time. So that's how, when we farm differently and stop tilling and breaking up these fungal communities and stop adding chemicals that kill these communities, we can, when we plant a very diverse cover crops, as an example, species diverse, we can feed all those different organisms and have it ready for the cash crop, the farmed edible crop, when that time comes in the season, to be able to grow into and source its nutrients, source all of those micro minerals and elements that we need in our food. They can then access it through the biology. You can never get it from fertilizers. Fertilizers are just a few elements, but the biology will help bring all of those micronutrients that plant needs for its health, for it to fight off its diseases that it may be stressed with, or its pests that it want to eat it. And that it can do in a very, very healthy soil. So the miracle of nature is that wisdom. And we, in our reductionist Western thinking, want to break apart and find out which bug, which insect, which bacteria does what, isn't as important as standing back and saying, wait, how do we just support this so complex interdependent system that it will function without us ever having to understand all the different intricacies of going on. I really hope nature doesn't divulge all of her secrets to us. We seem to want to control them, exploit them, profit from them. But in essence, how do we work with them and support them? I said recently, and this, which I think is the miracle, I don't want to talk about hopefulness, obviously, but I want to talk about reverence of the miracle of photosynthesis. This is how carbon dioxide comes out of the atmosphere. and oxygen is released for us to breathe. The plant absorbs what now is too toxic for our life in the atmosphere and takes it out of the atmosphere and returns oxygen to us. The most amazing thing to me in the world, and it was years ago when I was much younger, I thought, how come where my giant oak out here in my backyard, that's one of the largest oaks I've seen, why is it on top of a mound and there isn't a big hole that it sucked all of those nutrients out of the ground to make this body, this big trunk and these branches? A tree, a plant builds soil. It adds to, it doesn't take from. It literally is created out of thin air, literally, because it's made out of carbon dioxide and water with photosynthesis, the energy of the sun. What a miracle. Out of thin air is this giant oak tree. In its oak hardwood, its leaf, all the birds and insects and life that lives in it came from thin air. And that's all carbon dioxide turned into carbohydrate and wood and lignin and leaf. The same for our food. So when we support it, we could actually go back to what nature did 400 million years ago and draw it back down. We could take all of those emissions out of the atmosphere and put it back into the ground where it's desperately needed for life, for all of life. So let's get on that bandwagon and let's get those policies and let's buy food from companies like yours, Bethany, that are committed to that effort not in a greenwashing way, but in a real way, supporting the farmers to go regenerative, to go carbon capture, soil building, regenerative agriculture.
It reminds me of a lot of stuff Lauren and I talk about, because it's like there's this concept of basic trust. And like contrasting that with like scarcity. So even some of the farmers or some of the people who write are like, yeah, but you're not going to have enough nitrogen. You're not going to have enough this. You're not going to have it. So how much comes literally out of thin air, and being able to orient towards it and trust, like to step into more of a state of trust, like from that state of consciousness. It sounds like that there's a big part of the invitation there. And what you said, I hope we don't know all her secrets. Like can we learn to trust her process? I always say to Lauren, like a lot of it's like getting out of the way to let nature do what it knows how to do. Like how much can we get out of the way?
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels I notice. And I don't think, like, what do you think about the state of farmers and people who are growing food? What is their level of access to that? I mean, they're doing it every day. Their hands are in the soil. They're there. Do you sense that people are in that state of trust and reverence largely, or not?
Some are and some aren't. I mean, I know farmers at all, from all levels of consciousness. I know farmers very large scale, and it's all science to them, which means, the plant needs NPK, bring nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and pour it to the plant. And they trust it's going to work. They've seen responses year after year after year. They can bank on it, literally. And so that's a trust. But what also is, if they really look at their soil tests over the years, the health of that soil is declining. The carbon levels are declining. And so where is that carbon? It's now in the atmosphere. So much of our legacy carbon that's in the atmosphere now comes from soil, from the 10,000 years of plowing, and now from our chemical agriculture. So in essence, we have certain levels of trust, but some of it can be naive or it can be kind of ignorant and not really understand the complexity, nor therefore have the reverence for that complexity. And I would say a lot of not just farmers, us in general, don't hold that reverence and don't hold that awe about nature. And then how do we support her to function well? So we can get a soil to function well in a living soil, bring that life back, bring that biome back through like the Johnson Sioux inoculants and through the multi-species cover crops. And we can really make that system jump and start to capture carbon at 10 or 11 tons per hectare per year. And that's
for the uninformed. Can you quantify it? Like in real layman's terms, like, what is the potential? Like, what type of shift or change would need to happen for us to reverse the curve around greenhouse gases?
There's enough acres farmed, enough hectares farmed, acres or hectares, depending on what part of the world you're from. That's how you refer to it. A hectare has 2.4 acres in it. But in essence, if you look at how much we farm, there's enough at 10 tons a hectare to actually equate to all the emissions we emit now. Now, that's not to give coal and fossil fuels a pass. We have to stop that now because we have to draw down, not just eliminate. And realize that rice that you and I are talking about offline here, Bethany, rice is about 11% of those acres, and you can't really capture carbon in that system. It's a matter of, can you reduce the methane emissions and reduce the negative impacts with that much of it? Mm-hmm. And there are going to be some situations where you're not going to do that. But with grazing land differently, we could start to pull and make a more healthy biodiverse system, but pull this excess carbon out of the atmosphere as we radically reduce our emissions and start to return climate to where it needs to be. But we have to do it now.
And on a global level, like we would have to get all of the acreage that we're growing agriculture on.
We probably don't have to do all of the acreage. I'll say this, David Johnson did an experiment where he returned all the biomass. In other words, he didn't harvest any crop off the field and grew a couple of major cover crops and just returned it. And he got double that. So in other words, if you had land, whereas we put land here sometimes in conservation easements or set-asides or whatever, if we literally started to farm some of this land for carbon, for climate purposes, we wouldn't necessarily have to turn all the acres into this system. But having said that, if I would go to those African farmers I worked with and just say, follow this regenerative biological system, you're going to get, in my fields in Africa, I got 5 times the yields. And that's with no outside inputs. I didn't buy anything except seed. That's the only thing I bought. I didn't buy anything off the farm. Just what was in my field, I was able to get 5 times the yield. So they would have surplus food. A lot of the hungry of the world would be fed right with that, and they'd be capturing carbon, and they'd have more drought resistance, and they'd be able to percolate more water, and they'd have more diverse biology, therefore less insect damage and healthier plants. All of that would come as the co-benefits that nature figured out how to do. So yes, all of agriculture should go this way. But if we really got busy, we could take, therefore, with surplus food, because these smallholder farmers could produce even a lot more on their tired and poor soil. What we could end up with then is land that we literally could have, as David Johnson would say, more net primary productivity per acre than a rainforest. We could produce more biomass, therefore carbon, farm a couple of or 3 cover crops on that, and return all that carbon to the ground. What an amazing opportunity there is for us to turn this around.
And if it's a win for all, if the system is so divinely intelligent, where everyone gets what they need, including human beings, around food and sufficiency, why isn't it here yet? What is your theory? Because when we started, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, why are we more committed to dying? Do you have an answer for that?
Well, there are some others. I read a book once. I wish I remembered the author's name. It's the title of the book's Hope. It's literally, that's the title of the book. And he is a spiritual explorer. He's more adept spiritually than most of us are. Anyway, he had gone to the World Ecological Conference in Brazil back when, and one of the he cited that one of the agribusiness magnates said to him, as they're having these ecological conversations on what the UN should do towards the environment, and he said to this environmentalist, "I'd like to take you to lunch." And he says, because for one reason I can afford to and you can't, because he was a CEO of one of our big, agrochemical companies. And he basically said to him, I know what you're saying. I know it could be done. But he said, I've already made my deal, and I get to have my fast cars. I get to take you to lunch because I can afford to. And that's the deal I've made. There is a sense of greed in the world that supersedes the sense towards the benefit for all and for life. There are those factors right now because the work we're doing, we're assuring that it is all open source. Anybody can access it. It's free to everybody. Well, how many business people are you going to find that are going to come up and offer that? They're not, because they're trying to make a living, or they're worse than that. They're trying to be greedful with it. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do is to spread this and get it going all over the world and share it with all farmers, because it benefits all of us. And how do we get it to the smallholder? How do we get it to the large 10,000 acre farmer? And so that they can begin to utilize it. But there's adoption theory you guys know about. There's the innovators that can change their paradigm, their mindset really immediately and want to try it. There's the early adopters who go, okay, that looks great. You showed it to me, I'll do it. And then there's the 2/3 that are coming a lot later, and the really bottom segment that we have to wait for them to die because they'll never change. And that's human nature. That's ego constructs around beliefs. That's education. A lot of people have been educated to say that's impossible. It can't work. You've got to bring in the NPK. There's risk-averse people that go, well, maybe, but I'm not changing because I know how to do this. I don't know how to do that. And so it's going to take all of us to help this movement. In other words, us who eat food, we need to start asking for regeneratively produced food. It's going to take companies like yours that commit to sourcing from it and educating farmers how to do it. It's going to take perhaps policy to incentivize it. Maybe it takes paying that farmer for carbon farming, for building more carbon in the soil as the only subsidy given. Don't give them any other subsidies. Say here, because that's a legitimate tax, I would argue. As an emitter of carbon, perhaps I should be paying a farmer to pull my carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's a legitimate transfer of payment for my pollution. You're fixing it. So here, take my carbon fee. So there may be all of these leverage points that we need to activate and have groups working on as a whole system thinking as to how we change our patterns as humanity. Mm-hmm. And I would love to see smallholder farmers in Africa get paid for their carbon. It would be an incentive to them. In years past, we couldn't do it because corruption, the money would never get to them. Now I'm kind of an anti-technologist, but let me tell you, technology permits us to get the money straight to them, because most of those poor farmers, even the workers that I had to come in my fields, had what they called a handy, a little flip phone. And they'd give it to me during the day so I could take it to my house that had electricity and charge it for them. And they could go home to their house at night that had no plumbing, no electricity, and they'd still have their little phone. And you can bank on those things. Literally, we could transfer payments into their bank account. Mm-hmm. And, we know people that are working on technologies that can start to measure remotely the carbon that's actually there. And there's a way to do this. So all of this, I think, has to be part of the whole to speed up the transformation.
Or I guess to trust that it'll happen, or it won't happen, or it'll happen on its own timeline. Because like what you were saying about all the different folks, like the innovators, the early adopters, like that's the same when we're coaching people around, like, where are they scared and reactive in their life, and where are they not in a state of trust, and understanding you can't force trust. Like, we all have a process, and we sort of have it's just the isness of it. Like, okay, you're just scared right now. That's all. Like, and that's the thing is, like, this is no different than any other, like, of the wisdom traditions. It's just notice, allow, notice, allow, notice, allow. Anything other than that, anything other than like acceptance of what is, I suppose, has an element of be different. And I think probably when we're out here being like, be different, people are going to naturally resist that, because we're not being with what is, at least enough that there can be an openness. So it's, there's something about it where we have this model, it's called above the line and below the line. And it's just a binary model to help people notice, are you in a state of threat or are you in a state of trust? And we help people get really refined at being able to tell. And I don't feel above the line about climate change. I have moments of it. I think about it a lot. I want to be above the line. I want to be in a state of trust. I'm not. Total extinction, my kids not having access to food in 30 years, like mass migrations and famines. And that's real scary to me. And I have like I'm probably a little more facing this stuff because I'm talking about it on a day-to-day basis with people in the field. I am in a state of threat. And I think until I can, Deb said, our friend, mutual friend, Deb, who's also a coach, said this to me once. She's like, Bethany, she's like, can you experience the last white rhino dying as love? Can you actually be in a state of acceptance around that? And I'm like, no. And she's like, great. And you're just not above the line yet. And I'm still doing my thing and I'm below the line a lot and I'm reactive and scared sometimes. And that's the place.
I gotta interrupt.
Go ahead.
Because okay, what's here? I get some anger.
Great.
The anger is like, that is such a fucking oversimplification. That it's dangerous to oversimplify it to that degree of like, oh, this, that's just obviously what's happening over here. But like, there is, in my opinion, there's a collective grieving that would need to occur where we are able to face the consequences of what we've created. And there is an imbalance of human beings on earth who are available to feel that grief. And so when you talk about these people, the greedy, kind of CEO framework, that like my experience is that the concrete that we see in our planet is in the consciousness of human beings, in the consciousness of a majority of them. And that we're feeling all the energy and all the grief of Mother Earth as she feels herself die, as she feels these things happening to herself. And someone like you're available to feel that. Yeah, you're going to be fucking below the line or whatever phrase you want to call it for a long ass time, because that's how much grief and shame there is to feel. But there's a disproportionate amount of us feeling and not feeling that. And that at some level of consciousness, those egos know that if they were to face, like truly face and feel in a body, they would die. They would not survive the shame. And so as a result, that collective concrete just gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And so this
Thor.
piece of like, yeah, that's Thor. Like, yes, we can see it as love. I'm not saying, but it's like, that's such a bypass to me. It's like a bypass of like, of the level. There's a proportionality or like ratio thing for me. It's like when you murder someone and you take a life, there's a proportional, energetic, karmic reaction that is not the same as if like I borrow your shirt and I forget to give it back to you. Like it's not the same. And like I believe there's like a karmic equation that has to be balanced. Like that's a part of the reciprocity of being in this universe. And until we as a collective are willing to become more available to feel and hold those karmic realities, it's going to fall on a few of us. And we're going to feel very helpless and overwhelmed by the amount that we're trying to carry as like a small group.
Well, maybe it's the way I'm making sense of my resistance to being completely available to my feelings all of the time, because I wouldn't be functioning, I guess, in my role or in my day-to-day life. So I think it's just sort of to me, I'm giving myself some permission to be where I am with that, and I can see how it could be bypassed. That's the point almost, because it's too much to be there all the time.
Yes, I think that something about my journey on the planet is the amount of heartbreak that I have experienced in a body, and the survival of it, to see like, oh, every time I experience deep heartbreak, my capacity for love is greater. So the nervous system has created a story or a belief that heartbreak is equal to death, because of the impact of, because most of us experience heartbreak very young and in traumatic ways. But I think what's actually true is that if we start facing the heartbreak, the belief that our nervous system cannot make it is not the reality actually. Now, could we not fully function in a 9 to 5, 40 to 60 hour work week for a significant amount of time? Would we need to take breaks? Would we need to create some resilient strategies to move through that time? Absolutely. But I think that there's a fragility in like our collective, and I'm really not talking about you specifically, because I experience you as proportionally way more available for heartbreak than the majority of, people, period. But I think there is a fragility in our ability to hold emotions that is not real. And I think that
Lauren, I want to affirm what you're saying, and also hold where Bethany is from the standpoint that we do have to understand our capacities to hold what we can, and then be able to have some disassociation from a conscious disassociation, psychological separation from trying to hold it all, because it can become too much in a lot of spaces. If you go back to the work that actually, her name is the mother. She was a French woman that moved to India, worked with Sri Aurobindo, and then the work that Robert Sardello does with the School of Spiritual Psychology. You take this into your heart, and it does have the capacity to hold it. But psychologically, where we often put our psychology is in our head and in our mind, and that's behaviorism, and that's dysfunctionally pathological. But there's more space down in here that's not thought-based, that's not threaten-based, that's not fear-based, that can hold that space and can actually dissolve some of that, the power of those feelings. But I think it is a point of grieving. And Bethany, I've known you long enough to know you hold a deep concern about the future of this planet for your children, especially when you're thinking in terms of what the future looks like, because it looks very much at risk. There's no question to that. One of the things, because I have felt, and I went up to Chico State because we had a field day up there. It's a 6-hour drive for me. During the Paradise Fire, we had a training. The campus was closed. The fire was so bad, but it was a fire that didn't just like have a deep reddish haze across the Central Valley there, the Sacramento Valley. It literally had this dark black cloud that went over the whole valley, and it was like night during day. And I went to my hotel that night feeling the psychological oppression of the end of the world, of death, of not being able to breathe, of not seeing the sun, of food not being able to be produced. And it is powerful, and it's hard to hold that space. There's no question in those kinds of travesties. And so I don't think we all can right now. We're all prepared to right now. I think we do have the capacity, but it does take some training for us to get into that space. But here's a piece to reflect from, this isn't 30,000 foot, this is 30,000 mile view. And that's to say that David Johnson outlined the 5 previous extinctions on this planet, major extinction levels that took place, and the dinosaurs we all refer to, but there were major extinction events that occurred. Every time this planet had a major extinction event, the biodiversity returned more robustly each time. So is this the death of the planet? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there's major extinction event, maybe humans are part of it, but what may return in this Mother Earth and life might even be more diverse and even more robust. And that's why I say we don't have the knowledge, wisdom, we're not in control of it in our egos, but there may be a plan here. By the same token, I still feel I have to serve because I know enough to know we could stop this killing, this destruction, and this suffering to the level that it would come. So let's do our part, let's everyone.
And you know enough to trust your heart space and to trust the care that comes when you're in that space. And you're right. There's a lot of things we don't know. Lots, way more than we think. Much we don't know in a sense. But the things that we can know are our own experience, our unarguable experience, and what happens for us. And if we're moving on that, it's pretty reliable.
Yes.
Well, and I had the thought that the nervous system integration that we talked about at the beginning, that maybe that is our hope. That is a hope that if our nervous systems integrate enough that we can hold the grief and that we can face it, then there is a timeline where humanity could be a part of, co-creating the healing of biodiversity. But I think also what you're pointing to, Tim, is Mother Nature, Earth, she's going to be okay. And if she has to wipe us out to be okay, that's what's going to happen. And when I feel attuned to Mother Earth energetically, it's like that mom that wants to give you every possible chance, and just keep showing up for you until she just can't anymore. And that's what I feel like. That to me, Earth, that's the liminal space of hope that we have at this time in history.
Earth gives without ever asking, and she will always keep giving as much as we keep taking and damaging. And she keeps giving and trying to readjust, trying to heal, but we're pushing it too far right now. And I often hear the phrase well, Earth's gonna get rid of us because look what we did. No, we're going to get rid of us if that happens. We're the ones doing it. She certainly is not. She's trying to readjust, to rebalance. And it's just that we've pushed it so far out of balance now. This is the consequence, and it's just a consequence. So it is the price for our behavior. It's just a lot of other species pay for it as well at this time. But perhaps if and when she can reheal, if we don't fix this in time, it may come back even more glorious. Who knows? And hopefully, if humans return or if a species like us return, hopefully it can hold this wisdom or can reach deep within to understand this wisdom, that we don't dare separate ourselves from nature and from Earth. We must stay deeply connected.
Well, what comes up for me is I've told that story about how I think about it in a binary around, am I reactive about climate change? Yeah. And I think it's helpful. It's helpful for me. It's all an old story a little bit too. I was I've been telling this story. I've been saying this a couple of years. So there's a way where I do feel that it's less helpful in the same way that it once was. The way that I noticed that it was helpful was for me to not be in a state of pretending that I'm not reactive and then going and doing stuff, pretending that I'm clear and clean. It helped me actually face the level of my own reactivity that does live here, because that was really hard for me at some point.
Sure.
It doesn't feel so hard for me to be with that and acknowledge that anymore. I acknowledge that it's almost always here on some level or in some part or whatever. Yeah. So maybe it's less helpful. And the thing I noticed that when I'm kind of being with it, that I'm bumping into, is when I first started with all the somatic therapy that I was receiving, my system, just my own shit, my own rejection stuff or my own whatever, my little things in my little world here in my body, that stuff, just feeling that stuff felt so overwhelming. It felt like I was going to die. If I let myself just actually be embodied around the stuff that I found really scary or traumatic, it felt like death. And I would scare myself and not feel it and disassociate. So, because I thought I was going to die on some level. And then when I started to do the work and commit to it and go slow and be friendly about it, but do it, I was like, oh, I'm not going to die. And what Lauren's pointing to is this radically different experience I've been having for the last 2 years, which is I'm not going to die. I can be with it. and maybe on a global collective level, so the part of my brain that's like, you're going to die is still there still. It'll probably always be there. And it's not as big anymore as it used to be. It doesn't feel so black and white. So I guess I can hold the part of myself that's like, you're going to die if you feel it all the way through, honey, you'll die. It's too much, take a break. And I can also feel the part of myself that knows that actually I can hold quite a bit. And those just feel a little more integrated than when I started telling that story and making that.
That's wonderful
analogy, I guess.
Love it. That's wonderful. Good.
Well, I'm thinking about what's so funny that this is what came up when you said that. So like I talk about, I'm transitioning in this relationship that I'm in, and like in this moment, which is very rare, in this moment, I'm so grateful for how much my heart was shattered and how often, because I see like I am alive and I'm fine. And in fact, I'm better than fine. I'm like, there's like a restoration of it. And that particular type of heartbreak was the part of me that was like, this is the closest to death, is to feel this, or to like have this particular, that's the flavor that my nervous system was like, this is the closest to death. And I just think there's something for us collectively in stepping towards, at our own pace, right? Like at the speed with support. And my sense is too, like as we heal and are able to do more healing in community, that there even could be an acceleration in some of our ability to hold what you're saying, because I think that we're meant to hold it together and not all by ourselves. And that's, I think, what I was really pointing to earlier is like, we're meant to hold grief together. We're meant to hold joy together. We're meant to stay in awe of a sunset together. And there's something different that's available when we move out of our individualism and step towards that together.
And don't fail to remember to give so much of this unholdable aspects, feelings that we have to Earth, because she composts most everything and makes life out of it, brings it back in a very positive way.
That's such a beautiful.
Yeah,
and not leaving her out of what community means and is. Like she is part of that community.
Tim knows our friends Tom, and I'm actually going to Sarah's tomorrow to stay over. I'm going to see Sarah. But
please give her my love, please.
I will.
Please.
I will.
Right.
We've got these T-shirts kicking around from the farm that Tom runs, Finca Luna Nueva, that says "Walking Compost." So even our fear of death, there's a way in which it's not death. There's a way in which we are the cover crops, and we will return, and it will bring new life as we decompose, and it will stimulate soil depending on how we bury ourselves and all that kind of stuff. So even just our ideas about all of it is pretty up for.
And there's another little phrase coming out. Larry Copal, Tom's partner at the Carbon Underground, is releasing a T-shirt that says "Mars is for quitters." And just because of this consciousness, let's go to Mars. So if we kill Earth, we go to Mars. And I often say to the Elon Musks and all over the world, what? You're going to leave a living planet for a dead planet? I mean, come on. Let's take care of the best we can what we're doing on Earth now.
I want that T-shirt. This is where life is. I'm about to email Larry. I need that T-shirt.
That's right. Mars is for quitters. It's fantastic.
Well, we're coming in for
I love this ending for this. I love this ending for it just perfectly kind of ended in summary statements.
Thank you for spending this time with us and sharing your wisdom and experience with us. Tim, is there anything you notice wanting to say to feel complete?
I just want to end in gratitude for the two of you who are holding a level of commitment to human consciousness that wants to build and hold life at the core, and that wants to bring love into the world where we so desperately need it. And that's what I'm feeling from you. And this is not an emotion, it's a feeling. And I want to thank you for your good work and your good thoughts. So
thank you. I want to appreciate, as we close, like I just experience you as sacred wisdom. And I feel so honored to like be in the presence of sacred wisdom. I feel like I'm just playing and learning and, you know, hope to move into a place of like true wisdom one day. But yeah, it's such a gift to offer that to us. So thank you.
And
I am flattered. Thank you.
And as I mentioned, when I get in that scared overwhelm, when I get in that place, like, I'm going to die, we're all going to die, that you've reliably been like probably like the oak tree in your backyard. That's energetically what you feel like to me. Feels like you hold, it feels like stuff builds underneath you. And I like to think of myself as one of the things that's building underneath you.
Oh, that is flattering. I'm humbled. Thank you.
I was thinking, like, now having interviewed you and Tom was right. Tom is it?
Tom.
I'm like, wow, Bethany is surrounded by these really amazing men, you know, and to like hold and see a vision of possibility. And that's such a gift.
Well, I like that because there's like Lauren has stuff like she does like white supremacy culture work. So she's always like, she has a thing about like part of her work is like, and she's speaking for the whole. And my experience has not been that way largely. Like I've had a different experience of white men. And so part of me is that I get to introduce Lauren to white men that she's like, yep.
Well, thank you.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you,
absolutely.
Tim. Appreciate you.
All the best. Thank you.
See you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Hey, everybody. If you've got any feedback for us, we welcome it, or ideas about future guests, email us at healingcollectivepod@gmail.com. Our website is thehealingcollectivepodcast.com. We are at Healing Podcast on Twitter, and we are at Healing Collective Podcast on Instagram. Special thanks to Monda Creative, who edits all of our podcasts, and Two Tall Women Productions, who produce. Thank you.